This episode of Untold Stories is sponsored by PowerSwap. You'll hear more about them later on in this episode. What is up, everyone? I am Charlie Shrem, and you are listening and watching another epic episode of Untold Stories, where together, twice a week, we get to dive deep with some of Bitcoin's earliest adopters, crypto's most influential leaders, those who have been out there building the craziest things that's going to power everything about our future lives, about the lives that we're living right now. People, we're talking to people that are building sound stages with AR scanning rooms so you can bring costume dragons into the metaverse, like NFT relationship mapping we've been talking about a lot lately. We've been talking about Bitcoin and its future inside of the whole crypto landscape. We saw the relationship between like sound money and then the rest of the crypto world. I feel like we're coming to like a really good place of where everything kind of is going to fit in really perfectly. Today, actually, it's my pleasure, it's my honor to introduce my guest, John Devadas. John, thank you so much for coming on Untold Stories today.
Thank you very much, Charlie. The pleasure is all mine. Truly a privilege to be on the show with you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. You've written extensively about everything, about computer science, about cryptography, about things like psychology, biology. You are you're the head developer. You lead the developer whole community at the Neo blockchain. Neo is actually, and when we were doing the research, Neo and Ethereum came launched around the exact same time, and I distinctly remember a lot of Neo stuff in the early like 2015s. So you could say that Neo was one of the first post Bitcoin non-proof of work blockchains. I think it was called like Antchain or Antshares or something at the time.
Yes, you're right, Charlie. It was called Antshares, and I think that's a very good summary. It is, I wouldn't say it is one of the first proof of stake chains post BTC. Absolutely.
Focusing on like a proof of stake Byzantine fault tolerance. And I was just looking at the history, and actually now I'm very happy. Like it's nice to see a community, a blockchain that's been around for a long time, just constantly growing and building out the community and doing a lot of different things, because, a lot of people are trying to claim that, blockchains don't have long-term survival rates. They'll 2-3 years later, they'll go away. There's no point, the new technology. But I completely think that's so wrong in every single way. And also, what's really cool is that you're on the planning commission. You're the chairman of the planning commission of your city where you live. That's really cool too, because I'm friends with like my mayor and the city commissioner, and I think like city planning is a lot about has a huge relationship in like how in society, how we all kind of work together, and there's so much that goes into that. How did you get into that?
Absolutely. No, that's a really good point. So you did look up my resume, Charlie. So thank you.
Of course.
How did I get into it? About 7-8 years ago, I came to the realization that I wanted to do something to give back in terms of public policy, and especially at a micro level in terms of my city, my community. And I was looking around to see, what could I give back my time and my energy. And as a developer, having been a developer guy all my life, and as an architect, the planning commission to me seemed like an interesting area where I could provide my expertise. And that's kind of how it began. I went and I talked to the guys, I talked to the mayor. They seemed to like me. So they said, okay, right, we'll nominate you. And that's the journey. But I'll tell you, though, I learned a lot in the process. I've learned things good, bad, and ugly about how our policies are formulated.
You built some crazy tools at Microsoft a long time ago, tools that I used like the Arc of .NET, and was it Visual Basic or Visual Studio? And I remember actually having to learn a lot of these things in high school. So it's kind of cool talking to the guy who built a lot of these projects. You would argue that Microsoft was for a while the developer world of the internet and modern computer, probably in late 90s, early 2000s.
Yes, Charlie, absolutely. I'm glad you've used the products. I spent close to 2 decades. You're right. I built and led the architecture efforts and the team for .NET, before it was called .NET, shipped frameworks and tools for Visual Studio, which includes Visual Basic, C++, C Sharp, and so on, and also built out the early Microsoft application platform, as well as working on Azure long before it was called Azure. In fact, you might or might not know this, but the code name for Azure was Red Dog, and so we used to wear red-colored shoes. That's the team working on Red Dog.
Yeah, what's with the color red in computer programming? Red Hat, Red Dog, Clifford.
Well, this is a probably, I don't know, is it opportune or inopportune to talk about red at this time, but certainly
So
red,
you've
for us at that point, it was more of a shift away from the blue scheme that much of .NET had, and that was the farthest we could get away. But eventually, as you realize, the Azure color scheme, was not red. It was once again a blend of blue, as most of Microsoft's developer products are these days.
I wanna ask you a question about that. You've built your career around being not only building tools but creating very developer friendly communities. The developers are the builders, and developer could mean a lot of different things. And if you actually look at which are the strongest protocols today in the blockchains, which are the largest communities, one of the things you look at is like activity and developer activity. How do you like reconcile? And I also want to know how you were introduced to Bitcoin in the same respect. But how do you reconcile something like Bitcoin, where it was almost like a project driven code base that is almost supposed to not really change much anymore and is not really supposed to have a huge, I'm not, it's not supposed to have a huge developer community, but it's just very different than what you were used to building.
Yes, that's a really good question, Charlie, and I'll give you a few perspectives on it. First, in terms of developers, so if you look at the globe, there's about 22 plus million professional developers worldwide, and something that the blockchain and the crypto world gets completely wrong is because they're happy with 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 developers. And I say, look, guys, that's a drop in the ocean. You're sitting in a corner of the room and saying, I have this number. Forget about it. If we are truly to make a socioeconomic impact on the world, then we should not forget there are 20 plus million developers and that we need to go to them, not make them come to us. What does it mean? It means that we don't go about inventing and creating languages and new frameworks and tools. No, that we use the existing languages and tools that developers love and are familiar with, they enjoy using, which means a polyglot stack, much like what we've built at Neo, right? C Sharp, JavaScript, Go, Rust, Python, you name it, right? It's a fundamental flaw that much of the early, and I blame much of the Ethereum folks for this.
Yeah, they created their own language called Solidity, and I never understood why a blockchain couldn't launch and be any language, support any language.
Absolutely. No, you're right. And that was a blunder, right? A blunder of the highest sort, mostly because the people who built it were not platform people. They were essentially building, if you will, a stack. So you had to have lived and walked in the shoes of developers for multiple years, maybe more, to understand what developers want and need. And that's kind of the view I come from, which is having spent close to 25 years building developer tools and platforms, right? You mentioned Bitcoin in
Yeah.
terms of the project, vis-a-vis developer ecosystems and projects here. There's a couple of things I want to introduce. Firstly, I think of this notion of the half-life of a project, right? Many projects come and go, and even in terms of commercial tools, software applications, you might remember, and I don't know, I might date myself here, but we remember the Borland tools, the PowerSoft, Power Builder tools. They've come and gone, back in the late mid 90s. But there's a half-life, right? And so that's the critical way to measure, to evaluate. The second
Yeah.
thing is in terms of projects, right? Developers, and this is I suppose, a professional flaw, if you will, like to tinker and keep sort of fixing and adding and modifying. I say that, when I look at Bitcoin, it's less a platform, it's more an institution. And because it is more an institution, we don't need to be tinkering with it on an ongoing basis. If it's not broken, don't fix it. Unlike an Ethereum, a Neo, you pick your platform, right? Platforms are growing, evolving. We are adding new features, new capabilities. We are making life easier and better for developers. That's kind of how I see it. It's not black and white, however.
No, it's not black and white, and I think we're getting into the post Satoshi world now, where it's you can almost as if we move towards what I think we're going to move towards, there's going to be a much bigger separation, especially how people view Bitcoin and then crypto. I don't even say cryptocurrencies. I don't like crypto assets, so you call them crypto. There's going to be a difference, and that relationship could be like these tools and new platforms need a sound money or whatever that is. Who knows where that relationship is going to be? But I really like what you said. Maybe we'll title the show that, like, Bitcoin is an institution, because it is the institution. It's a set of beliefs, political, ideological, um, technology beliefs. Like, you can almost say that are you a software purist?
Am I a software purist? Not at all.
So it's like, you think Satoshi was almost like a software purist? I don't know, but it's nice to see that we're moving towards uh that future. Why do you think so now, as a developer yourself and leading teams, what did you think of the original Bitcoin code base when you first came across it?
Oh, brilliant. Genius. Just one word, genius.
Yeah, a lot of people wonder why there were some things in there, like there was some code in there to for potentially like shuffling cards. I think it was for like some poker work. I think there was an like a vision that that would be the potential future, or like applications built on top of this Bitcoin thing, or applications built on top of like a crypto world.
Good point. It's a good point. I want to just go back to the point you made earlier with respect to Bitcoin being an institution. I'm glad you like it, because I believe this is something that's being lost in sort of the maze, the cloudy aspects as we look across the various projects. This is a fundamental thing, Charlie. We have to emphasize that what we are building with blockchain technologies are not applications. Excel is an application. PowerPoint is an application. Salesforce is an application, but Bitcoin is an institution. And to further add to this, the economic basis, whether you go back to IE or NIE, the new institutional economics, there is an economic basis to these institutions. And very simply put, right, for me, the aha was these are self-governing institutions. Apps do not self-govern themselves. They are passive, inert,
Yeah.
but Bitcoin does, right? And that's why we need to understand that there is a different perspective. To my platform friends, I say it a little differently. What I say is that in the history of computing, Charlie, we've seen multiple waves of platforms. Actually, I worked on mainframes, and I'm going to date myself here, with punch cards when I
Oh
was in
my god.
college,
Wow,
right?
like the big rooms with the punch cards in them and everything.
Absolutely. And
You
we had
needed
to block time and say, look, I get this 20-minute slot when I was in college in Madras in India, right, to go, basically use my tech, right? I've seen PCs, client server, web, SOA, the cloud. But there's one thing, Charlie, which we need to emphasize. In the history of computing, there has never been an economic platform. Never. Blockchains are the first economic platforms in the history of computing, meaning we have crypto economic protocols baked intrinsically, innately into the stack. Fundamental difference. And this is why so many of my old friends in the enterprise, classical IT, traditional IT world are unable to understand, to grok what is it that makes this tick. Because if you come in with a 20, 30-year perspective on traditional platforms as plumbing, pipes and wires, it's very hard to see what an economic platform looks like.
Why? I mean, so how would you describe it to them then? What would you say? I mean, is that a good way of describing like Web 2 versus Web 3? Rebuilding the pipes?
Yes, that's another very good distinction. So two things. Firstly, how do I describe it? I describe it to people as platforms, even economic platforms. In the enterprise world, there are billions, tens of billions, hundreds spent on things like governance and compliance. And in the Bitcoin world, we don't do that. You know why? Because it's baked in. Governance is baked in, right? And so this is a fundamental shift in terms of how to think about. There is no overlay we have to build. Use Amazon Web Services. There's only one customer, one client, right? So how do you ensure governance? You got to bring in busloads of enterprise consultants, big consulting companies, big money, a lot of waste, right? And fundamentally in this world, we design the incentive model, right? We design incentives and disincentives. And that's not how things have worked in computing for 50, 60 years, not even close. So when I talk to my old enterprise, friends and buddies, they look at blockchain and say, okay, it's a database. It's a decentralized database, right? And therein lies the flaw, because at best you're seeing half the side of the coin. The other side is the economic stack. How do you exploit the economic protocols? And that's a challenge we face with respect to, I think, the traditional mainstream industry players, which is why we see mostly non-traditional, developers and builders in our space, Charlie.
That's a very good, interesting point that you'd make to your friends because a lot of people do just see it as a decentralized database and they're missing the economic unit of value there. And most
Precisely.
people, especially like the pundits that you see on Bloomberg and wherever today, they can't rationalize. So they understand now Bitcoin and crypto is self-evident. Neo, it's self-evident. Its existence validates its own existence or whatever you say. There's a reason for it to be growing. There's a reason. There's a value to it. There's price discovery, supply and demand over many, many years. So I think people rationalize that no problem, but no one really understands how it originally got its value in those first few years. I mean, even all the books and the films and the documentaries, and I know because I'm in all of them and I've read them all, they still don't grasp. And I personally still don't. I remember like when the first Bitcoin economy was created, it was the only way to earn Bitcoin was to get it for free from a faucet or to earn it by doing some service to the community itself. You're contributing to community, you're contributing your own time and energy into this thing that you love that you didn't expect to get a return. And then you get this like Bitcoin unit of value thing. And then you got this Shrem kid, myself, selling pocket knives for Bitcoin on the Bitcoin forums. So you can redeem your Bitcoin for things. I was selling like JetBlue vouchers in 2011.
Yep.
So it's like it created this very small economy of like misfits, but then all the apps and the development kind of came later. And so now I kind of want to know, like, for those listening, um Ethereum gets all the credit nowadays, and everyone is looking for the Ethereum killers, or the Solanas, the Terras, I blank out. There's so many of them now. I'm talking about them all the time.
Yes.
Polygons and Cardanos and all of them were most started by a lot of the early people. Tell us the difference between Neo. What's going on under the hood? What you're very, very developer community friendly, but that term developer, we're not just talking about the people who are sitting writing 24 hours of code, right?
And in fact, they don't want to, right? So a couple of things. Let me start with saying how I think about developers and the developer experience. So back when I was at Microsoft, we had this sort of visual model I used to use. You know, you probably hike. Most people hike. When you're hiking, especially a multi-day hike, you have maps, you have compasses, you probably have food stores, you have boots. It's a bit of it's work. It's climbing uphill. It's a bit of a grind, but eventually, you get there to the summit. But it's hard work. Now, on the other hand, I don't know if you ski, but many people ski. Skiing downhill is fun, is pleasure. You enjoy it. There is no map. There is no compass. There is no grind, right? You just enjoy the experience. And that's the difference between how, a successful developer platform comes through to developers versus a developer platform that's not designed with devs in mind. So number two, what we have done here in the last two plus 2.5 years or so is we have built the best developer toolkit in the industry, Charlie, bar none, the best dev toolkit. And this goes all the way from the fundamentals, the inners. When we came on, there was no really meaningful debugger in the blockchain space. We have built the best debugger. For example, time travel debugging. One of the things that I worked on with my buddies back in Microsoft, being able to go back and forth, right? We've made this very simple, very easy to use for developers of all shapes and sizes, whether you're a professional, whether you're an amateur, right? Being able to have symmetry across private, test, and mainnet,
Yeah.
And so I could talk for hours in terms of the dev toolkit, but I would say, folks, if you haven't given it a spin, try it out. We have built the best dev toolkit bar none. It's comparable to, if not better than, Azure and Amazon Web Services. And I can tell you this because I built the dev tools for Azure.
Most people are like me though. We can go into a GitHub. We know our way around some libraries. We know we can maybe read. Someone asked me actually the other day. They said, "Charlie, can you help me identify where the code is in a specific blockchain for the burning of tokens?" And so I had to like go in there. It took like 2 hours to find it. Um, and I'm like an entry level. I'm like a 1 out of 10. If you're a 10, you're like you. If you're a 1, 0, you know nothing about developing. I'm at like a 1 or 2, and I think most people are like that. It's such a stupid question, but there's no such thing as a stupid question, but how can I get to like, I don't want to be a 7 or 8. I'm not trying to develop full time, but I want to be more confident around code base, especially when talking to CTOs and hiring developers. That's such like, I need to know enough.
No, it's a really good question, Charlie, and I'm glad you asked it. What I suggest is just, all of us don't have to be developers, and certainly we don't. There is I would say the key is being able to read code and then to write code. I certainly believe the skills to read code significantly, and sometimes maybe equally, if not
Yes.
more, right? And that's what I would suggest to people is, you don't have to hold yourself back. Anybody listening to the show, right? Don't hold yourself back. Don't feel like you have to use Visual Studio or code or any of the tools. Just being able to go to GitHub, like you said, Charlie, being able to browse around, look at it, get a sense of the flow. Forget about the
Oh
nuts and
man.
bolts,
You know what we should
right?
do? We should put on like literally do a podcast where we just go through various blockchains code base and just go through
Yes,
what does and means. No one has done that. I can't find that anywhere. Let's talk developer toolkits. How are we supposed to do that?
I love that you said it. Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you. And in fact, maybe sometime we will do, another show together. Plus, I love it. I think that's the
Yeah.
key: is to be able to understand. Right then, when you're able to read, so much of the walls fall away. Right then, you say, okay, this is the logic, this is the flow, this is the forget about the nuts and bolts. The core devs can take care of the nuts and bolts. Forget about it. But just being able to get a sense of, because architecture, and having been an architect for 20, 25 years, Charlie, architecture, how do you evaluate architecture? Two things. One is elegance. It feels good to you. You like a certain building. You go to a church, a cathedral, you go to a museum, a library. You enjoy the experience. The second is the longevity. How long has it lasted? Right. The same thing for software. When you look at software code, you read it, you say, is this elegant? Because beautiful things are elegant and beautiful things are good. That's kind of how, basically in nature, as human beings, and I'm going into other branches aspect of here, but I believe, divinity, is very closely linked to elegance, to beauty, right? The second thing, of course, we discussed earlier, the half-life of the software and the longevity. How long is the code base without getting into this big mess, right? That's kind of how I evaluate architecture. I want to go back to something you said earlier about Web 2.0, Charlie, if you're okay with it.
No, yeah, and anything I ask you that because I ask like 3 or 4 questions at a time, I end up writing down what we need to come back to too. Like I want
Very
to
good.
talk about Neo in a little bit. I want to talk about, but yeah, go anywhere you want. I'm saving all the information.
Well, thank you. I do want to go back to Web 2.0. You mentioned a little bit earlier. And in fact, I'm writing an article on Web3. I call this Web3 sense and nonsense.
Oh,
And
I
to be
like
very
that. That's a
candid,
good idea.
because to me, Web2 is a bit of a cesspool, Charlie. What began as user created content. If you remember back 10, 12 years ago, was the idea that users create content. And now we have ended up with surveillance capitalism. I don't think
Yeah.
any of us want to build on that particular base of surveillance capitalism. So I'm not at all a fan of this Web3 terminology, right? When Web2 itself is such a shaky foundation to me.
Would-
And again, to my earlier point, if you see it from an economic platform perspective, we don't need to build on another base, Charlie. We have the base ourselves. We are the first. We are building the first economic platforms in history. Forget about Web2. Web2 is just, was just a bad detour, in my humble opinion.
I mean, we're using those protocols. We're using like TCP. could you replace that? I mean, is that something that we could almost like not replace, but create a complementary, better version of that? And that's where I would see we're beyond like some new Web3. I can't really fathom that and how that would all work though.
That's a good point. The infrastructure, and that is to me the internet. Back in the late '60s, early '70s, when the universities, academia in the U.S. in particular, invested in protocols. Absolutely, the underlying, the core protocols, yes. But to me, the what I call the Web2 detour, I think probably created more. How
Yeah.
do I say it politely and politically correctly? Created more destruction than anything constructive with respect to the socioeconomic impacts of how we use the so-called Web 2.0 technologies, I think.
Honestly, I agree with that so much. It's almost scary that for the sake of the we're doing like we're you talk about divinity and perfection, like people make fun of me and I talk about how the Satoshi group could be some being or like time travelers or something that our brains can't fathom yet just because we're not at that level. You talk to physicists and we just don't have the brain capacity at this point in time to really understand everything yet, and we have to recognize that. That was one of the best things I ever learned, was that sometimes uh uh we don't have the neurological capacity yet. And but I wanted to, before we get into that, because that's like a very deep, we're talking about the relationship between mathematics and flowers and nature, and we're talking about things that Leonardo da Vinci predicted. He predicted a lot of this stuff. But I want to ask, okay, so here it's 1998. You're starting at Microsoft. It's 9% of U.S. households have access to the internet. It's probably a lot lower than that. Though I don't know where someone got that statistic. Now it's like 100% plus. We got billions of users. What did the internet world look like back then? Like looking forward, what did it look like? And if I would have asked you then, how do we onboard the first billion users? And what was missing back then? And then how would you like kind of compare it and contrast it to where we are right now in crypto land?
Also, that's a beautiful question. Lots of perspectives. I would say, first and foremost, back in '98, '99, there was a lot of discussion, debate about mobile devices and how they would bring in millions and tens of millions of people on board. But the fundamental flaw in much of the thinking was that so much of work, R&D and investment was spent on efforts that ultimately were proved to be, irrelevant by Mr. Jobs. Right? And,
Yeah.
and that to me is kind of, when I look back in that particular era, that was the big shift, that so much of what you might call conventional mainstream wisdom was just upside down, right? In one stroke, when, of course, Apple and Mr. Jobs did what he did. The second aspect in terms of connectivity, yes, you're right, probably about 8, maybe even 10% in terms of connectivity at that point in time. But we hadn't seen the advent of cloud platforms. That was an alien concept at that time for most of the industry. The notion that we could actually outsource, if you will, compute, storage, networking, bandwidth to the cloud was really something that we were working on, but was completely alien. The notion that you would give it away. Why would you want to have a server running at home? At that time, people were talking about home servers, right? I don't know if you remember, but there
I
was
remember,
a
yeah.
big detour.
It was called like a NAS or like a home storage device, like a
Yes,
server at your house.
yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Was that the name of it? I
NAS,
think.
exactly.
Yeah, NAS. Yeah. Bringing back
And also
memories.
the second thing, you look back and say, we've gotten so comfortable giving it away. We don't need to have these things in our basements and running. And the third thing I would emphasize, Charlie, is with respect to energy. There was not as much
Oh,
thought in terms of energy consumption, usage, and of course transmission and efficiency, and all of these things that today we're able to understand much better, right? And that's and by the way, on this one, just as a detour, right? People talk about how proof of work and energy consumption, and so I want to just, in a slightly, maybe
please
partly
do.
tongue-in-cheek comment, I would say, if you wanted to reduce energy consumption, Charlie, you know what you would do? You would ban HTTPS, SSL. Think about it. Think about the implications and how how ridiculous it would sound.
Yeah, like you couldn't do any security over the internet anymore.
Yes, because SSL co-processors, SSL processing, think about all the impact, right? I'm just saying, how ridiculous some of these discussions and debates actually, if you bring it down to the basics, are.
If the whole world was using like multiple blockchains and everything across, and if it was a mixture of proof of work and proof of stake, we'd use less energy than like home dryers, washer and dryers in the United
That's
States. I
right.
mean, it's a stupid point. In fact, like if we anyone just go do a study of who has built the dams or the hydropower plants in the past 10 years, and it's Bitcoin miners. I hate to say it, we are the green revolution. Without Bitcoiners, there is no green revolution. There is no alternative energy. It doesn't, yeah, there's no economic incentive to do so, like you talked about. You create an economic incentivization layer to all industries to be transparent. That's the crazy thing. It's so cool.
Precisely, precisely. And that's the key, isn't it? I mean, economic incentives and disincentives. And this is what makes Bitcoin, right, unique in the history. And this is why the platforms we're building, what I'm building at Neo, what people are building at Ethereum, elsewhere, these are economic platforms, Charlie. And how do we get this through to people? This is kind of, for me, and why I write a lot of what I write is because I want to get these ideas through. That this is not your father's platform, right? Let alone your grandfather's platform.
Sorry to interrupt your regularly scheduled programming, but I wanted to tell you guys that if you're using PancakeSwap, Uniswap, DYDX, SushiSwap, you're doing it wrong. You need to be using Paraswap because Paraswap is a user interface, a decentralized smart contract platform that sits on top of all of these. And when you go to Paraswap or untoldstories.link/Paraswap, because they're refunding your gas, if you go there, then you'll be able to, on top of Ethereum, Binance Smart Chain, and Polygon, look for the best prices for your tokens and swap and do everything in one predefined transaction on chain. Instead of having to do the approval to this token, to that token, to do all these different things, Paraswap does it all for you. It's decentralized. They just released their API version 5 that you can see everything. It's all open source. Very cool stuff. Untoldstories.link/Paraswap. If you're using any of the other decentralized protocols, you're doing it wrong because you need to be using the beautiful Paraswap routing system, and it's fully decentralized too. It's gorgeous. I'll talk to you guys soon. And this is like a cool question that I thought about today. How can cities incorporate this infrastructure? I mean, what type of things can you bring Neo? Can you bring Neo to like municipalities and cities and let's build out? Can we build out voting infrastructure? Can we build out like there's so much that goes on in city infrastructure that costs a lot of money, taxpayers a lot of money, unless you have a very well run city government. But there's so much underneath just how city contracts work. I was talking to the mayor of my city and I was explaining to him how we can take just that whole contract process and put it on the blockchain, and he was blown away by that because there's so much supervision that you have to maintain to prevent corruption and graft in that.
A really good question. I would say for us, for me, the tools we build, the developer platform we have built on N3 fundamentally has a vision of digitizing assets, all shapes and sizes and formats. And so this goes all the way. You can use N3 to have to digitize credentials, right? Educational credentials, college, high school, diplomas. You can digitize property taxes, property tax management, being able to have a way to, right, and all the way in between.
That's
That's kind of
cool.
how,
How
for
does that
me,
work? That could
how to digitize assets.
Well, let's talk about like using N3 to digitize like property tax. So anyone who owns a property has to interface with the property tax department. There's all ad valorem, all like stuff that goes in there of what we're
Yes,
funding, and then at the same time that whole process, like that's actually a great idea.
absolutely. Because look, in the decentralized world, Charlie, everything is a claim. Think about it,
Yeah, it's true.
right? In the centralized world, that was maybe not the case, but in the world of decentralization, everything is a claim. Even consensus is a claim. That is eventually validated or not validated, depending on POW, POS, and so on. And so when I look at cities, councils, commissions, state government, local government, maybe even the central government, we are dealing with mostly claims, right? What is ownership of an asset or a property? It's a claim. What is a diploma? It's a claim,
Yeah, it's a
right?
good
What,
point.
what is a what is a resume? It's a claim of
But now
some
it's like you don't
accomplishments.
have to trust, you verify.
Yes, right. And that's why for me, when we talk about assets, a lot of people think about assets in the very traditional sense. Yes, you talked about earlier in the beginning about stable coins. You can have asset-backed coins. You can build a oil and gas backed stable coin on Neo. On N3 you can build property NFTs in terms of
Oh,
real
that's so
estate
cool.
assets on N3, right? But all the way in between, for me, it's not just the classical physical analog. Everything is a claim, and if it's a claim, it's an asset that can be verified, like you said, validated, and eventually assigned, transferred. One of the things you talked about earlier is also multiple chains and interoperability. So just to give you a little bit of a digression here, I am one of the co-founders of the InterWork Alliance. So about 2 years ago, we launched the InterWork Alliance with the likes of Microsoft, Accenture, NASDAQ, SDX, and others I'm probably forgetting. The thesis was very simple, which is that no chain shall be an island. We know this for a fact. But in practical terms, this means that we need standards, specifications for schemas, protocols, and so we have built out the schemas. For example, the token taxonomy framework, TTF, is something I'm very proud of. And in fact, we have built designers, token designers for TTF, wherein business people, non-technical people, non-devs can come in and design and sort of create and visualize assets, tokens, right? So interoperability, having worked on this in the early days of the cloud at Microsoft and at Web Services, this is for me very, very critically important, right? Interrupt will happen, whether we like it or not, whether you want it or not. And let's do it right. Let's do it right with the standards-based. And so I work with the IEEE as a co-chair of the IEEE efforts. And in N3, we are implementing many of these standards and specifications because I believe, this is the right way to give back to the community, to share, right?
Ooh,
Otherwise,
yeah.
this notion that we're all building our islands, it's a lot of nonsense, I think.
Vitalik wrote about Vitalik wrote about how these bridges and wormholes are going to get hacked and they're insecure because there's no standards across all chains, and I agree with you. So 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 am I wrong to say that in the future moving assets from chain to chain won't require even a middleman service? We could potentially the standards could be built into the chains themselves to have mechanisms to do that. Is that possible?
It's certainly possible. I do want to go back to the comment you mentioned about Vitalik. So I think what Vitalik was saying was he was differentiating between multi-chain and cross-chain.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if you
I
look at
remember.
his blog post, right? So what he was saying, and I'm again paraphrasing him, he was saying multi-chain will happen, and he was saying cross-chain may not happen. And again, I'm paraphrasing his words, right? In some sense, I think he's right in that multi-chain, of course, like who's going to argue against multi-chain? It's going to happen as a fact of life, whether we like it or not. Private, public, it's going to be by geographies, the
Yeah, because
EU,
we
right?
didn't even talk about the regulatory. We're assuming every chain can be permissionless and open all the time, but that's not
Exactly.
going to be the case. And there's some chains that we don't want to. For example, if my city gave me one vote and a token to represent that, that should be a permission chain. You need to be a resident of the city to get that token.
Precisely, sure. Precisely. Right. And so multi-chain. Then you go to cross-chain. And I think what he's referring to is the challenges and in particular the security and the developer aspects tooling, right? The tools haven't matured. A lot of the people were talking about how, they are the cross-chain tools or cross-chain, asset transfer mechanisms, haven't really thought through. And this is why for me the developer toolkit, the dev experience comes in. Debugging on one chain is hard. Debugging across multiple chains is 10
Could you
times or 100
imagine?
times, right?
How do you actually do that when they're all using they're all built using different programming languages? I mean, why does the fact that we have multiple programming languages a foreshadow into like a multi-chain world?
It's a similar theme, right? Polyglot as in multi-language, the same theme, polychain, multi-chain, right? It's a kind of a fractal model, if you will, if you want to kind of abstract it to a higher level. It's very much a sort of recursive fractal approach. So how do you debug? Um, Quite simply, you think of it as a distributed system with multiple services and components. The happy path is always easy when you have a distributed system. It's only when the errors and the bugs happen. So how do you do it? Well, a variety of mechanisms. Obviously, in terms of debugging, being able to have the underlying mechanisms. I mentioned time travel debugging, right? This idea, that basically you can move back and forth in the timeline of the chain or chains. Critical aspect, absolutely critical aspect. Without that, you're really at best getting maybe 10, 25% of the debugging capabilities. We've built that in the dev toolkit, right? In the N3 dev toolkit. This is kind of the things that when I emphasize core developer experience and making it fun, enjoyable, this is where it comes in. Otherwise, think about it. It's a nightmare, right? And this is why when Vital is talking about cross-chain, he's right in that much of the industry has not caught up with the need for professional developer tooling, especially with respect to cross-chain. Eventually, we'll get there, but the question is, who gets there first and so on.
We don't even know what we're here to build yet. So it's like it's hard to rationalize the need for like epic developer tools because we don't even know, or we didn't really know what we're doing. You said this like a polyglot term that I had not heard of until today. But Neo is a polyglot blockchain, multiple programming languages. Is it the only I don't know how does that even work?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's the architecture that we've designed, right? So, in very simple terms, you can bake in a language into the platform. That's the worst thing you can do as a platform designer because you're tightly coupling a certain language and the underlying platform fabric, if you will, right? To design a platform right, to do it well, you have to appreciate developers come in, again, like we said, all shapes and sizes and forms, and they have different languages of choice. So you decouple the language, the tooling to build the smart contracts from the underlying platform. And then you have a layer of abstraction. In computer science, there is a very old joke, and pardon me for saying this, but it's a very old joke which says you can solve any computer science problem with a layer of abstraction. And there is truth. It's a joke because it's
It's like
true,
PHP.
right? It's a truth.
Yeah.
And that's what we do basically is you design these layers of abstraction to be able to decouple specific languages from the platform. Now, it takes more work, Charlie. It takes more effort. It takes more design skills and expertise, right? Which is why many of the platforms out there, and are they even platforms? I don't know. It's hard to say, but they've so tightly coupled these together where this notion of a polyglot approach is practically impossible, unlike N3.
My first business before Bitcoin, I had a company, Daily Checkout, and we're your e-commerce company. Uh, we had a whole back end platform that worked, and at the time, this was like 2007, maybe 2008, 2009. This was like when building comprehensive back ends to interface with multiple. So you had, and the reason I'm telling you this is because it was built on ASP.NET, and I'm remembering it
Ah,
all now. And what
I
happened
see.
was, well, this is what happened. And the show this way, there was a piece of software called Arcus, and it managed the company that owned my company had like 15 different electronics brands, department stores, like from B&H to Sixth Avenue Electronics, huge camera stores and electronic stores,
See.
inventories across multiple different categories and stuff like that. But their software was this DOS, like you'd have to launch like an emulator on your Windows computer to operate this thing. It was the worst. But the problem was everything was built on that. And there was this one guy, this old man who built it, and they'd have to hire him, and he was getting sick all the time. And I was the young kid. So they trained me on this. And so I learned Arcus. And this is probably why I never decided to continue my development like education was I hate there was no debugger. So I never knew if something would break. I hated the job of like having to go and like play whack-a-mole and fix and try to like figure out what the problem was. But the cream de crop, one of the best, and you're gonna laugh. I shouldn't even admit this, but one of my like high point of my career was getting a relationship between Arcus dot and then our .NET backend, which was how
Yes.
so you could do it. Dude, if I tell you how I did it, at some point, at part of the process was one of these pieces of software that just emulated a mouse and keyboard. Because there were some things with the Arcus, you just needed a mouse. You couldn't even, there was no API to like tell it to do something. So you'd have to actually emulate like a keyboard. Oh my God, man. The early
Oh,
internet was
that's
crazy.
fascinating.
I'm like an 19-year-old. I'm like, I'm never doing development ever again after this. I'm just going to be on the business side of things. But it was really a lot of fun, though. I like it bringing back cool memories now.
Well, we got to give you a spin on the toolkit, Charlie. You can build, test, debug, deploy a smart contract in about 2, 3 minutes. We'll give you a demo sometime.
That's really an amazing thing. So anyone could come on and spin up things.
And it's the way it should be. It's the way it should be, right? There should be as little, friction as possible at all. Any friction is just a block, an obstacle that needs to be removed. Again, going back to the developer experience, like you said, right? You did not enjoy it. Uh, Developer experience have to be enjoyable.
You kept it fun, the experience enjoyable. But there was a time when the governments around the world really wanted to regulate the internet or the protocols around it. Do you like what happened? When was that?
Oh, I don't know. It seems like they still want to do it. They don't dare,
Yeah. And
right?
it scares me because we had the internet as we know it today because uh you guys were largely left alone to like kind of do what you need to do for a decade or two. And so I'm nervous that with Bitcoin and crypto land it's still too early to create these walled gardens because we don't know what we're even here to build yet.
Oh, absolutely. Very well said. In fact, this goes by something you said earlier, Charlie, which is how do we know what to build or what they will build? The fundamental thesis in building dev platforms is build it and they will come, right? You build the best possible dev tools and stack, and you'll be amazed and astounded at what people do with it. When you give them those tools and the underlying dev experience. That's my experience.
You think that the one of the reasons that developers want to work on blockchain and crypto digital assets is just because the tools are just a lot more newer and fresher and the blockchains are newer and fresher and everything is just like it's you can enter now and learn it now and it's built for learners. It's built for people to come on as opposed for other things are built kind of in defense as you know they're built to solve problems that are coming at them.
That's a very good point, actually. So really, it's a very insightful point. Yes, and I like what you said about in defense, and that's what developers and builders don't really appreciate or want to do. I think it's a very good summary. I like it.
Yeah, the I remember at Instant, like the our problem was our demand was so great that we built our whole code base in defense. So it just was put together by like scotch tape and scissors
Yeah.
and I remember like a year and a half later, I'm like, we're never gonna be able to rebuild this from scratch because the users will just go somewhere else. And at that like a month later, Coinbase launched. I was like, well, if we shut down even for 2 months, we lose all of our business because there was nowhere else to go to buy and sell Bitcoin at the time.
No, absolutely. I like what you said. In defense, I think it's a very good way of describing. I'm gonna steal it from you.
John, I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on Untold Stories today. If you're cool, I'd love to schedule. I think we're gonna need like we could do it over multiple days, but we're gonna need a couple of hours. Maybe we'll release like a multiple part series where we can at least start with the Bitcoin blockchain and the Bitcoin's white paper and code base and just kind of go through it and like what does everything do? And we could talk about the economic incentives and how it all the relationship together. Then we can do some other blockchains. We could do the Neo next and then do some other ones too, because I think that's really missing.
Oh, absolutely, Charlie. I would love to do that, and I think you're right. Bitcoin with Satoshi's work is obviously seminal to everything we are doing these days. So going back and looking at the architecture, the elegance, and to understand the design patterns, I mean, that would be a lot of fun. Absolutely. I do want to thank you. I know you're a very busy man. It's been a privilege to connect on your show, and I want to very much thank you for giving me your time and just for the fun discussion. I appreciate it, Charlie.
You're welcome. Thank you. These podcasts are the best discussions I have all week, and I don't get to talk to very many brilliant people. So thank you so much again for taking the time.
Thank you, sir. Much appreciated.